Hey everybody. Um, okay, just checking all my stuff here. Um, okay, so this is going to be a response video of some sorts to Eric's video, talking with famous people. That was a response somewhat to mine, or at least I posted a video that sort of motivated him to sort of think of some stuff and put out a video, and I'm just going to share my thoughts too. In response to that, because that's how all this stuff works. So let's see here. My hair is like sticking up. I really need a haircut. Anyways, um, okay. So a few things, mainly because some points he raised in his video got me thinking of other things that I wanted to talk about, and so that may or may not be interesting. Okay, so a few things. I had posted this video talking about how the three body problem is sort of this kind of thought experiment of how typology gets overly complicated because you have too many variables in the equation, and the three body problem is sort of this old sort of thought experiment that people will use when they're talking about basically how it's hard, it's easy to measure simple things, but then as soon as you add one more variable, it can take something that's relatively simple and turn it into, super complicated and unmeasurable and unpredictable. And the book, The Three Body Problem, is sort of funny in that way because, and then I'm not going to spoil it, but they sort of come up with like a literal world where that's an issue. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, of course, the point I'm making is just just sort of a high level NI kind of thing. Like once you start adding a bunch of variables, this thing gets real complicated real quick. And also just to sort of make the point that there's like really no good reference point out there, or at least it's sort of universally accepted as a good reference point. Um, and so when you're trying to, make measurements of what somebody's personality type is in your mind, there's no, there's no distinct measurement that we can all sort of agree to. That being said, I do think using the defensible typology framework and methodology and sort of the way it sort of breaks everything down comes by far the closest to that, to giving you some sort of measurable framework. But even there, and I think Eric makes this point in his video, even there you're still dealing with people, and it's hard to make an argument that anything's independent of an outside observer, like physics or chemistry or something like that would be. Okay. So, but he did raise sort of an interesting point that I wasn't even really thinking about when I made the sort of analogy on the three body problem, of how it sort of raises this question of object and subject, and how they're sort of interacting with each other, and that also creates measurement problems. And if you sort of take the analogy to typology and really anything in psychology, it's sort of some of the issues I was raising in some of my other videos earlier on how, you got subjects and objects sort of interacting with each other, and how do you measure that? Because you can't really measure it independent of the observer, right? There's no sort of objective measurement. But watch my other videos, I sort of get to it, but of course, they're all over the place, and maybe I make the point. But it's sort of like, in my mind, it's sort of like, if you're a carpenter and you've got to make measurements to chop your wood and build your house or whatever you're building, and let's just say for whatever reason you couldn't buy a ruler, but you had to like check out a ruler from the ruler library every week, and you go and you check it out one week, and it's just what you and I would expect 12-inch ruler to be. You take it back, and then you go back the next week, and now they say, well, it's an odd number day, and so we're going to make the ruler 1 inch longer. And so instead of a foot being 12 inches, now it's 13 inches. And so now you have to work with 13 inches, and then you go back. And then they're like, well, it's a month with an R in it. So that means we got to take it down to 10 inches. And every time, you're trying to use this sort of objective standard to measure things, it just keeps changing on you. And that's what dealing with people is, and dealing with, anything psychology wise. So in a way, you just have to sort of be okay with that, right? And instead sort of thinking of it in the framework of, instead of trying to measure the person, you're trying to measure sort of the information processing they're doing. What type of information are we talking about when we're talking about a particular function? And then when you're talking about a type, it's all about, again, their attentional effort. How much effort does it take for them to spend on this type of function? But if you're just trying to measure them, sort of using the right brain holistic approach, you're going to run into, it's a month with an R in it, they're going to act different today or whatever, right? Or they're in this context or they're in that context, and you just don't have this sort of reliable measurement. Anyways, hopefully you get the point. But you got me thinking about it. It was an interesting point. But I think the bigger thing is, and I think he and I would agree on this. I've watched enough of his videos. I think he would agree with this. But one of the issues he raises that's sort of related to that is the subject-object problem. And again, one of the big traps that I see a lot of people falling into, and I myself fell into it, was trying to make it work, trying to make the pieces work for a long time, until I realized, oh, I shouldn't just be worrying about this stuff at all. And that's the, subjective versus objective issue that always is sort of creeping up, especially in socionics, and especially when people talk about, sort of the original Jung writings on this stuff. And I think Jung probably did more harm than good by like phrasing it as object versus subject. And like I've said in other videos, he wasn't really talking about objective in the sense of objective and independent of an observer. He was really talking about, are you focusing on the object, right? The thing outside in the world? Or are you focusing on the subject? In other words, whatever's going on in your internal world. But if you try to sort of parse that out and think about it in a way, and create sort of a system or a framework that makes sense or is, cohesive, it's going to fall apart real quick, because you always have a subject, you always have an object, and it doesn't matter which function you're talking about. If you're talking about TE or you're talking about TI, or if you're talking about FE or you're talking about FI, there's going to be a subject, there's going to be an object, right? So if I'm using FI and I'm thinking, okay, I don't like this cup as much as I like the other cup, but this cup will do. Like, it's fine. I'm not embarrassed to be seen around town with it. But, all things being equal, I like the other cup better. I like the color better, that kind of stuff. And so I'm engaging in some sort of FI process. And if I were telling you that FI is subjective, right? And it's, what's going on inside your mind as opposed to outside in the world, well, that quickly breaks down, because I'm talking about things outside in the world. I'm talking about two cups, right? And so is that objective? I'm focused on the object. Or is that subjective, where it's my own personal subjective opinion, right? And then the same thing could be said for FE, right? If I'm trying to engage with some person. Clearly I'm focusing my attention to the outside world, but my decisions that I'm making, or the sort of process that I'm engaged in, could be very, very subjective. Like, I'm dealing with my mom versus dealing with my boss, and that's going to be a very, very different interaction. And there's all sorts of subjective things that come into that. And so, Jung was, he was an INFJ. And so, he was a very prolific writer, had a lot of interesting ideas, but he, writes like an INFJ does, where it's like, it's sort of like this, it's sort of like that. You understand what I'm getting at? Yeah, you get it. And that's how INFJs talk. I mean, that's how I talk, right? It's like, it's kind of like this, kind of like that. You get it, right? But then you get somebody with like heavy duty TI who's trying to make a cohesive framework out of it, and it just sort of falls apart unless you define an object and subject in very, very broad and almost unusable ways, right? So, when I first started learning about all this stuff, I would get hung up on, is this objective or is this subjective? Because I probably made the mistake of reading the Jung stuff first and trying to understand what he meant by object versus subject. But it's a very INFJ thing, and it's like, you could explain it back to him and be like, yeah, that's what I mean. Okay, so again, for those of you who are sort of getting into this and might be tripped up on whether something's FE versus T, is it objective versus subjective, don't worry about that. Worry about what type of information is being processed, right? Is it in Eric's parlance, I think he would say put, get, retrieve, interface, and I sort of think of it as TI, FI is sort of your decision making, your deliberation. You got to figure out what's what, where, how do you categorize it? SE, NE is information about acting out in the world, either in the metaphysical world, like I'm going to share my ideas with you, or the physical world, where I'm just going to shove you out of the way. And FETE, that's interface, engagement. I typically call it engagement, where you're either engaging with a person or you're engaging with an object or a system, a non-person thing, and there's sort of back and forth, and you got to sort of interface with it, right? Like, it's going to be sending you signals, you're going to be sending it signals, and goal oriented. And then you got your knowledge base, which is your NI and your SI, and that's different types of information, but it's basically the knowledge that you're working with. And so again, like, I don't need to talk about whether it's subjective or objective. It's the type of information you're working with. Another thing about Jung, and this is just sort of a side step, but those of you who are more like proficient and know the Jungian literature, correct me if I'm wrong, but he had a very Buddhist Eastern philosophy of the mind. And one thing to keep in mind is that I think in Buddhism, it could be one of the other disciplines, but they think of, you basically have 6 senses. You have your 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, vision, hearing, your typical 5 senses that we think of. But they would also think of as your 6th sense is your thoughts, right? Your thoughts that are bouncing around in your head. And so there's this idea that, like, your internal sensing is things that are popping around in your consciousness that are sort of coming to light, sort of things that you experience in conscious, and that's going to be your 5 senses. But you've also got thoughts, whatever those are, right? Like your running monologue or whatever that's going on. And I think Jung, when he was talking about introverted intuition, was sort of thinking about it in that little 6th sense kind of way, right? And so when he's talking about subjective and stuff like that, he's talking about, sort of your internal experience. But even there, even if we go with that sort of broader definition, it starts breaking down, because when you're doing TE and FE and SE and NE stuff, you're still relying on your internal experience to sort of do all that stuff. So anywho, so he had raised the issue of subject and object, and I think we agree on that, on sort of the uselessness of focusing on that. Okay. But it was interesting that he made the connection to the three body problem, the subject object thing, and I wasn't even thinking of that. Okay. So the next thing, there were two or three things. So the second thing is another thing that I wanted to sort of make a video about anyways. And so this sort of motivated me to sort of look into it a little bit. And I've made references to this before about introverted intuition and having the metacognitive feel of knowing what you know. And not in sort of not in straight epistemology sense, but like the actual feeling that you get when you know something, right? And so it's not like, it withholds like logical scrutiny or validity. It's like when you see your mom, that's your mom, and that it's your mom, right? And it's just that sense of knowing, and I've alluded to it before. There's an actual brain system that is responsible for it. And I was going to link an article that does a pretty good job of giving the backstory of it, but Google apparently won't let me link to outside sources without some sort of verification. So if you want to find the article, it's called Deja Vu, Possible Parahippocampal Mechanisms. It's in the Journal of Neuropsychiatry from Joseph Spatt. That's S-P-A-T-T, M-D. And it was published in February 2002. And I think if you Google it, it'll probably just come up. So it's worth a read because he gives a little bit of the history of this phenomenon that I'm going to talk about. But there's actually one study that I used to talk about in class all the time, and I just can't find it. I've been looking for it for a while, and I can't find it. And I don't know if I'm making it up in my head, but I'm pretty sure it's out there. But what they would do is they would take epileptic patients who needed invasive surgery, right? If your epilepsy is too bad or too, problematic, where you're just having constant seizures all the time, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll just open up your head, your skull, and go in and find sort of the problem area. Because a lot of times it's like you have some sort of scarring or something, and that's what's sort of making things go haywire and giving you the seizures. And so they'll try to take out the tissue that's causing a problem. But before they do that, they have to make sure that they're not taking out something that's like absolutely critical. And so they'll put in electrodes in around that area, and then they'll have you do a bunch of sort of cognitive tests, because you're actually awake, or the patient is actually awake while this is happening. And they'll see things on the screen, and they'll read words or identify objects. They just want to make sure that they're not taking out anything too absolutely critical. And so one thing that they noticed is, well, a couple of things. Number one, a lot of epileptics would have seizures, and then they would self-report that they had this sort of deja vu feeling, right? That they would have this experience that they had been somewhere before. And we probably all have that sort of deja vu experience, right? Like you're in a drive-through at a coffee shop or something, and you sort of feel like you've been there before, and you're like, yeah, I think I had a dream about this the other night or something like that, right? Well, a lot of epileptic patients will get that all the time when they have seizures. And so they were sort of testing it while they were doing the operations, and they would sort of record out of that area. And, not only can you record, but you can actually stimulate it, right? And so they would stimulate that part of the brain, the interrhinal cortex, is right up in your medial temporal lobe. So you get your hippocampus and medial temporal lobe and parahippocampus and interrhinal cortex and all that. You can look it up online, but it's basically the stuff underneath your cortex, and it's responsible for a lot of learning and memory. And they realized that they could basically induce a sense of familiarity in these people, right? Like play a song that was sort of like a new song at the time, but they would, stimulate this area, and the person would remember hearing that song at like their 5th birthday party or something like that, where it was like impossible because the song didn't exist at that time, right? So they knew they were basically creating this sort of, not really necessarily a false memory, but just a false sense of familiarity. And it somehow connected to like, an event tied to their birthday or something, right? So you create a sense of familiarity, but you also tie it to, some memory. But one of the things they would find, and again, I'm trying to find this article, is that, even after they got done with the experiment, like the person would swear that they heard that song on their birthday. And like, even if you tell them, look, the song didn't come out until you were like 25, there's no way it could have been playing, when you were 5, at your 5th birthday or anything. I mean, they would just absolutely be convinced that, that memory is right. And even though, in the face of subject or objective information that would prove them otherwise, they are just hellbent, that they really did experience that. So there's this area of the brain that when it gets activated, it gives you that sense of knowing, that feeling that whatever it is you think that and it could be remembering an event, or it also could just be knowing a fact, right? Like, when was the Declaration of Independence written? What year? And you could give a response, and then you also have a sense of knowing that knowing that you're right. And there's also stuff out there about like, when you're right and you're right, your neurons are sort of more in sync, and they sort of fire off at sort of a gamma rate, as opposed to when you're a little uncertain, they're not going to be as in sync. And so, there's a lot of stuff going on at the sort of neurological level that's giving you this sense of knowing, right? So what does this have to do with typology and all that? Well, one of the points that Eric makes in his video is that, when you get the, by and large in the MBTI community, the typology community, you get a lot of intuitive intuitives that basically trust their intuition about, whether Elon Musk is an ESTJ or an ENTJ or whatever. They come up with this sort of like NI representation of it. And, and it's basically hard to convince them otherwise. And I would argue that, that part of the brain that's giving you that sense of knowing that you know something is intricately tied to whatever's causing your NI, whatever is underlying your NI process. And there's a lot of arguments of why the hippocampus and the limbic system would be tied to that, because it's associated with associative memory and linking up representations and the relations between objects and things like that. And you throw on top of that, and so that's sort of pattern formation, right? That's sort of your NI creating this sort of knowledge-based system, or the system of knowledge out of nothing, quite frankly, or at least tying, representations and associations together. But then you layer on top of that this sense of knowing that we know you can't even be logically dissuaded, or like in the case of the people where they would associate a song with their 5th birthday, you couldn't even logically convince them with objective data that they're wrong, that this feeling is wrong. And they might tell you, like, look, I know this sounds crazy, but I just remember it, right? And so it's, again, with the MBTI community, this is what I always think of, right? Is that people will build up these little pet theories, these associations down in their limbic system, and they layer on top of that this sense of knowing that they know. Okay. And I would argue, just in life and in general, especially if you're like an INFJ or an INTJ with lead intuition, just understand that that's what's going on. And, oh, here he is. Obviously, I'm not paying attention to what's going on in chat. So it always cracks me up, and even outside of the MBTI community, when you're dealing with somebody who's a very intuitive type and they're just wedded to their representation or their idea, you just want to sort of kick them, take them aside and show them the study. I can show you definitively that, your brain is tricking you. So this is so relevant to my current career expense. Yeah. Sorry. Is he an INFJ? Let me see if I can link this article in chat. I think you get a kick out of it. Send it to him. Yeah, totally. And I think that's the biggest INFJ trap. Right? And for those of you who are watching the video later, Eric popped up, and so we're chatting. Of being wedded to this NI representation, and I do think that it gets tied to this deja vu. They call it the deja vu area, or the deja reve. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And you sort of get it with SI stuff too, but SI is a little bit like that's they can actually point to an experience where they learned it, right? It's not their pet theory that they're coming up just out of their ass like the INFJs do. I mean, the SIs, they've actually experienced it. Now, there's false memories. People's memory isn't nearly as accurate as they think it is, but it's a lot closer than some of the goofy things that the INFJs and the INTJs come up. Don't need to type your question out. Okay, yeah. I'm not used to this stuff. This is all weird to me. Okay. What are your thoughts out there? Does that make sense? I don't know how long you've been watching. What else? Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess the point I was trying to make is that if you look at sort of what I think is the neuroscience underlying NI, and I could be wrong, but you've got this hippocampal system and the limbic system that's tying up relationships and forming patterns and things like that. But you've also got this whole layer of things that, you have a area of the brain that tells you that you know what you know, right? And like gives you that sense of feeling. Like when I see my mom, I know it's my mom, not just because I know it's my mom, and I also know that I know it's her, right? Or I know that the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. But the interesting thing is you can create sort of false knowledge in these epileptic patients that would have open brain surgery, and they would go in, they'd play a song, and then the song was sort of a modern song, and then they'd sort of go into their hippocampal area and stimulate it, and it would bring up a memory of like their 5th birthday or something, and they would associate the song that they were listening to in real time with this memory. And then after the experiment's over and everything, they are absolutely convinced that that song was playing in their, for their 5th birthday or whatever, right? And no matter how much you try to tell them that they are wrong, they still have the feeling like, no, I really remember that, right? And you could say, look, the song just came out. It wasn't around when you were 5 or whatever, but logic doesn't work. Right? It doesn't override that feeling of knowing. And they might even tell you, like, yeah, I get it, but I'm still right. Right? Or I still feel it. I suspect knowers trust their knowledge more than action types. Oh yeah, definitely. I would say so too. I don't trust either my memory or my intuition much, frankly. Yeah. Yeah. And to me, I think it's a big thing that INFJs have to get over, right? I mean, like, it's the Mike Tyson thing of everybody's got a plan until they're punched in the face. And I think INFJs and INTJs have to deal with that, right? That they have this overconfidence of whatever they know that they know, and then reality hits them in the face. And it's a lot of tough lessons, I think, for a lot of INFJs. Um, Watch my Dracula video too. I'm convinced Dracula is an INFJ because of this, because he's obsessed with one particular representation despite what's going on around him. All right. Particularist dumbness. Yeah, yeah, but yes and no, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times at my job where I'm surrounded by ESTJs and ISTJs, right? I mean, it's a very SJ environment. And it is a very, very old institution. It's been around for over 100 years, and they do not change. They do things the way it's always been done. And then you get an INFJ or somebody who's like an intuitive. And I've got other friends at other firms that are the same way. And we start piping up about how, they should change this, they should change that. And then, they refuse to change, and we get all upset because we know we're right. And then like 2 years later, something will happen, and I'm just thinking like, oh God, I'm so glad that they didn't do what I told them to do. I'm so glad that they just stuck with the tried and true. Because if they had done what I had told them to do, it probably would have blown up in our face, right? So, so as I've gotten older, I've learn to appreciate the SJs in the world and their particularist dumbness, at least in the business world, right? Arguing on the internet, all that kind of stuff, yeah, that's, you don't want to get an argument with an SJ on the internet. That's completely pointless. Yeah. I mean, just look at another point I was going to raise is, I don't know if you've been following like the FTX collapse and all the crap that's going on at OpenAI, and the WeWork collapse, and it's basically a bunch of these unicorn businesses that fell apart because they had intuitives running the show and not enough SJs. They just like FTX is just the perfect example. It was probably the Sam Bankman-Fried guy is probably an INTP or an ENTP. And there's this real famous interview where he was being interviewed by like Forbes or Wall Street Journal or some reputable source, and they and he was just like playing video games the whole time while they were interviewing him, and he just like laid out his whole business plan, and it was basically a Ponzi scheme, and he didn't even realize it. And the interviewers were like, "Well, that basically sounds like a Ponzi scheme." He was like, "No, it's different because we got all these he had some sort of NT explanation for why it was going to work, and of course it didn't work, right?" And and it was just like him and all his NT friends just sitting around running this company, thinking that they didn't have to follow all the SJ rules. But the SJ rules are there because, people think they can outsmart the system. And yeah, they might for a little bit, but somebody is going to come in and, hand them their lunch, which is basically what happened to FTX. The Binance guy came in and just fucked them. And if they had followed all the SJ rules and segregated accounts and all that kind of stuff, and done proper accounting and blah, 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 they wouldn't have had the collapse that they did. But they were NTs and they thought they didn't have to follow the SJ rules. And so, and so several $billion later, here we are. And you see the same thing happening over at OpenAI. It's just a bunch of NTs and probably some NFs running the show, and it was a $90 billion company that almost collapsed overnight. $90 billion, right? And yeah, well, tell them to watch my video. Yeah, but I got my ass kicked a lot to develop any sort of sense of self-awareness, right? But law school did it. Law school helped. But then I went into the SJ world, and I remember working in the SJ world, and they were just like, yeah, do all this SJ stuff, like make checklists and save documents and print out signature pages. And I'm just like, you're paying me to do this? Well, surely you must need my intellect for something more complicated. But I learned real quickly that they don't care. They don't care about how smart you are in that respect. They want conscientiousness. And it'll, so all the INFJs and all the INTJs out there that have everything figured out, go work in a business world for a while. Let it smack you around, because I think it's the best way to, if you're gonna use this for self-help, that's the best way. Yeah, especially when you're TE polar, right? And you don't know it. And then the other thing is like, I mean, I wasn't super into this stuff at first, but I thought I was sort of like an INTJ or an ENTJ, and TE stuff was just like, my thing. Come to find out it's not, that it's a very different thing. Yeah. But I think you'd be, if you haven't been following the FTX stuff or the OpenAI stuff, I think you'd get a kick out of it, because it is just a bunch of NTs running around being NTs, thinking that the world doesn't apply, the rules of the world don't apply to them because they're too smart. And then, one thing happens and you collapse a $90 billion company. And of course, they're bringing in all these SJs now to run the board. They're like, yeah, okay, we'll bring in the SJs. We got $90 billion we have to worry about. Protocols are structured for very specific reasons. Sometimes that one can't do. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're talking about like system, like business protocols, or regulations or rules or laws, yeah, I mean, it's it's hundreds of years of people fucking up, right? And then or either fucking up or like deliberate bad actors who go in and expose a weakness in the system, right? And so every time you have somebody fucking up or some deliberate bad actor, you're going to see a whole host of regulations come out that try to address these sort of TE protocols, because it's all just trying to idiot proof, very large systems that, yeah, any sort of NT can probably figure out, and doesn't understand why they have to check all these boxes and fill out all this paperwork, but it's there to, idiot proof things. Um, and and I don't know what TE is for other than to make things idiot proof. Oh, hey, another fellow INFJ. Welcome. So I'm ragging on the INFJ. I like to rag on INFJs because I feel like I can. And we're talking about just not getting too wedded to your theories, because it's going to smack you in the face once you hit reality. So, but Eric, to your video that you posted a couple of days ago, I mean, again, I think this also sort of underlines the general ethos, I guess, right? And the MBTI community of all the intuitives just thinking that they're right all the time. And they have that sort of right brain, like, oh, of course this person's an ESTJ. And they can probably break it down and, put the square peg in, or the triangle block in the square hole, kind of thing. But it's that interrhinal cortex right there in the limbic system that just tells you that you're right. No matter how, and it's not only that, but it's just the fact that like logic cannot disconnect that feeling of being right. Like even stuff that like I have been shown in the real world just doesn't work, like an option trading strategy or something, some like NI kind of thing that I came up with that doesn't work nearly as well as I thought it would. I still have that feeling like I'm totally right. Like, it's just, it didn't work that time, but it'll work all the other times. I can vouch for this one. Yeah. All right. I'm going to take a break. I'll be back. Are you going live? If you're going live, I'll join you. Okay, cool. And I want to do another thing. I want to do a whole artificial intelligence thing. I've been doing some of your polar tests, or at least derivatives thereof, on Chat GPT, and it's interesting. It's real interesting. It can actually, it does some interesting things. Okay, I'll see you on the flip side. If you go live, I'll join you guys. I'm a goes by the name. Oh, okay, cool. Oh wait, there's an INFP out there who I thought was Dulles. Am I misremembering? Okay, we'll figure it out. Cool. See you guys.